So just going through my slides, I've realised that one of them is missing, which isn't ideal, but essentially it's just a massive greasy burger that we all know exactly what it looks like, so we're probably not losing too much. So I've been at Deliveroo for about 15 months, so I'm going to talk through some of the kind of challenges we face as a business, especially around our early careers programs. Quick hands up, who's actually used Deliveroo? I'm assuming there's quite a lot. Perfect. I'm not going to ask about Uber Eats or Just Eat because we don't care about them. But essentially, so we are, as a business, we are 6 years old, just over 6 years old, and we are still going through rounds of funding. So the reason why that's kind of quite an important piece of information in the context of our early careers programs is when I joined 15 months ago to kind of head up the teams, I was quite surprised at how attached we were to experienced hires. And part of that is around if you're going through funding rounds every year, then actually the business is really intent on making a quick decision, making a big impact, and actually to invest in some of the early careers programs takes 6 months or so to actually see some value and return out of them, was the kind of stereotype that people had. So we would hire experienced hires and try and get them into place. We are now probably like 15, 16 months further on. We're still going through rounds of funding, so we're at Series G, so the last round of funding was last summer, where Amazon invested $500 million in us, which is great, and some of you have probably seen that that's still going through the CMA to make sure that it's all above board, which we are entirely confident it is. Once that happens, we will be in a far stronger position to actually start to plan our kind of organizational design where we can start to plan to kind of 3 to 5 years ahead, which will be really impactful for us from an early careers perspective. So 6 years old as a business, we are in just over 500 towns and cities. We're in 13 countries, both in APAC and Europe. We've got 3,000 employees globally, 80,000 restaurants on our platform, which is a pretty scary number, 35,000 of which are in the UK. I had no context of actually how many restaurants are in the UK, but that's a pretty scary number. And actually we've got 60,000 riders globally and 30,000 of them in the UK. So it gives you kind of some kind of scale and how much we've achieved in 6 years, which is pretty impressive. So in terms of context, as I kind of say, we're still going through rounds of funding. What we also have found and we've encountered is that we don't have enough experienced managers to train people and actually invest the time in hiring these junior talent and kind of upskilling them properly. So we often have conversations with the business. People are engaged and they want to explore this in more detail, but then it comes down to it and actually we don't have enough managers to necessarily support them across the multiple teams that we operate in. So we've got a big challenge around that. Things change on a regular basis, so we can be working on one thing and then suddenly actually the goalposts move. I'm sure that's no different to a lot of businesses that you guys are working in. And we can't necessarily hire apprentices, grads, interns, work experience and do everything at the same time. So one prime example is that we are working on hiring graduates into our software engineering teams. And the conversations from our perspective is, that's great, but actually we should be doing internships because that becomes our pipeline. The challenge back is where we don't necessarily have enough managers to support hiring interns for 3 months, getting them up to speed, and then actually when they roll off, we have to then go through the same process to hire grads again 3 months later. There is a reluctance to do that. So at the moment, we are still in this kind of phase where we need more internal success stories to actually be able to roll this out on a kind of much wider scale. So the business can see actually these guys don't take as much upskilling as people expect them to. We don't necessarily have any proper pipelines in place, so we are quite ad hoc in the way we engage with universities and colleges and different schools. There are a lot of kind of internal referrals from people who went to this university and have attended this kind of coding boot camp. So we do have a lot of interactions and we host a lot of events in our office for kind of tech and especially women in tech events. But there is no consistent pipeline, and actually personally, my view is that if you're going to engage with universities, you've got to take a 3 to 5 year approach and you're not expecting instant returns. So we are still in the early phases of that. The flip side of that is I think we are lucky enough to have a really strong employer brand. So actually, a great example of this was we hired 10 graduates last summer, but we actually only started that whole process in April. But we still had 300 to 500 applications for 10 roles because our brand's really strong and people are really interested in tech, innovation, and kind of these new kind of tech companies that are coming up. So the fact that we've been voted or identified as the fastest growing tech company for the last 2 years in Europe massively helps us in that respect. So the stuff we have worked on so far, we are hiring software engineers. Hired 10 last year, we're hiring 10 this year. The great thing is that now we're starting to understand more about it. We've actually moved that timeline further forward, so we've actually hired the majority of those before December or before Christmas, which is a massive step, and now we've got the 8 to 9 month plan of how we actually keep them engaged and work on the onboarding experience. And we've also got 10 potential mentors that are in the business from last year who can help, which will be a massive step forward. Work experience entirely ad hoc, same as most businesses. Somebody wants somebody to come in, we just need to figure out a way to do it, but there's no set process. So we're working on a centralized program for that. Internships, exactly, again, not necessarily consistent, but we hired up to 50 into our marketing and sales teams last year. That was based on quarterly, hiring 15 into marketing per quarter. And actually, from an apprenticeship perspective, I was quite surprised that nobody was talking about it. There was no conversations. Nobody asked me about the levy for about the first 9 months. Nobody had any idea what this money was kind of being taken away to do. So no one was actively talking about it. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is actually how do we use that money? This is free money. We don't have huge L&D budgets, so why are we not supplementing that in some way? So we've got identified and started to work on 3 core ways that we're working on apprenticeships. And we've got 3 suppliers that we're working with, 3 apprenticeship providers, and they're kind of split into 3 different areas. So we're using White Hats, who some people might well know. So we are using them for IT support, digital marketing, data science, and those kind of roles across the business, so our kind of central HQ type roles. We are currently got 4 people in the IT teams, and the plan is that we're working on is to build a cohort for September around kind of 10 starting across those teams. What I really want to build into that is how do we onboard 10 people in one go? How do we start to build a plan that we can get them trained for the first 2 weeks, take some of that ownership away from the line managers, so the argument that actually they need management support can be taken away, so we can offer some centralized support. We get them cohorted, so it doesn't matter whether they're sitting in data science, digital marketing, or IT, they are part of their own network. So that's a work in progress at the moment. And then we also use Makers Academy. So Makers are for software engineering in particular. This is the first time we've done it, and we've kind of speaking to Makers for a while, but never really worked out how to do it until we realized that there's this pot of money available that we can just instantly pay to train, which is great. So we've essentially identified 4 people to come onto a current pilot who started 12 weeks ago. They're on a boot camp. They actually finish on Friday, which is quite exciting. And then they'll come back into the business, but I'll discuss that in a bit more detail. But the one thing that I'm really interested in, especially I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 months, is actually how do we start to give away some of our levy? So quick show of hands, who's actually spending all of their apprenticeship levy? Pretty scary that none of us are, but it's exactly the reality. Has anybody started to think about giving away their levy to some of their partners or restaurants? Cool, yeah. So there's a few companies that are starting to do it. So we have started to work with a company called Hit Training, who are one of the industry experts on chef and hospitality apprenticeships. For us, as a company that sits across the heart of the hospitality industry, it makes total sense for us to want to give back to the restaurants that we support. And actually, one of the biggest findings that we found through talking to some of our restaurant partners is that 8 out of 10, so we've commissioned some research from the restaurants, 8 out of 10 restaurants that we partner with are saying they're struggling to hire chefs and kitchen staff, with 7 out of 10 saying, again, like kitchen staff is 7 to 8 out of 10 essentially saying it's difficult to hire. The challenges we faced, we hired some chefs for a while, and the challenges we faced was the churn was just so phenomenal. By the time you've got somebody in, it could be 2 weeks later before they decide that they can get another offer just up the road for £2 an hour more, and off they go. And there's not that much we can do about it. So we are working actively with the restaurants on what is it that we can do to make their lives easier. We are very conscious that we have a duty of care to the whole industry, whereby there is a perception that we are taking some revenue away from restaurants. The reality is actually we're adding more revenue when you actually look at the details. But these kind of partnerships are really what kind of sets us apart from your Uber Eats and your Just Eat. So we've made a decision internally that we're going to focus on small restaurants, potentially independent restaurants who don't necessarily have levy pots, and they actually don't have the training capacity to pay for people, especially around chefs as well. So what is it that we're actually giving away and what we're doing? So from kind of the government scheme, you can give up to 25% of your apprenticeship levy away every year, and that is based on what you paid into your levy in the previous tax year. So we had to work out what that looked like for us. You can give that money to as many companies as you want. So whether it's just one, you're going to train one chef in 20 different restaurants, that is entirely fine. You can work with those companies and you can start to distribute your levy to them. The 25%, as I say, is based on previous tax year. So although it calculates obviously on a monthly basis, this is for last year. So the numbers that we're giving away, we expect to rise considerably over the next year. And as that payroll increases, obviously that levy giveaway will increase as well. And then you can also use the companies that you're giving it away to have to register online through the HMRC, and they can work with the apprenticeship provider that you're essentially working with to help make that easy. We haven't yet got there, so I don't exactly know the details of how long that's going to take, but I'm hopeful that it won't be too long. And then essentially what we had to do to get this signed off internally. So we had no one talking about it internally. Nobody knew how much our levy pot was apart from the finance people who didn't really know what this money was or what they could do with it. So we can work out what 25% of that would be. Once we had that, we could then work out exactly what we wanted to do with it. So for us, it's a very clear mandate that we want to work with restaurants. We want to make their jobs easier. We want to create an industry that is easier to hire into. So we identified an apprenticeship provider with HITS, and we started to explore actually how we could create our own chef academy. So actually, if we could hire 50 chefs a year, put them through an academy, potentially start to second them into different restaurants. So spend 3 months in Wagamama's, 3 months in Five Guys, whatever it might be, then actually we can start to kind of have a big impact on the wider industry. Very quickly, we realized that actually that wasn't particularly sensible as an approach because it meant that we had to hire 50 people. We were responsible from them from an employee perspective, and actually we then would have to work out how to cross-charge these restaurants for 3 months. And what would happen if they went to a restaurant and then they decided they didn't like it and left? We had no control over this. So actually halfway through, we kind of did a bit of a U-turn and realized that while we still wanted to help people and help the restaurants, we needed to do it with a bit more of a hands-off approach. So the giveaway was kind of the easy part to identify from that perspective. So we essentially had to go through our legal and HR and finance teams and compliance to make sure they're comfortable with this. We're essentially giving away free money from the business perspective and money that we can utilize internally, but seeing as nobody was talking about it, that wasn't overly hard to get anybody signed off on that. And then once everybody's engaged on it, we then started to talk to our restaurant partners. So we have a restaurant partnerships team who are doing this all day, every day. They're offering different partnerships, whether it's employee benefits, whether it's help with their recruitment process. We are kind of listening to them on terms of what is it that we can do to make their jobs easier. With the hope that actually if we offer this, we would like some of the restaurants to take up and benefit from it. So we've been talking to them for a few months on how this will work from our perspective. And then the main step was, how do we work with HITs? So the conversation is, you go out and get new business all the time. Can you now build this into your offering that actually if you're a small business that don't have your own levy pot and you want to hire chefs, then come and talk to us and we're more than happy to distribute our funds accordingly, which is really interesting. So we feel quite proud of that. And then the last part was around PR and comms, and actually how do we start to get some value out of this from a PR perspective. So we spent a couple of weeks putting together a PR release, going out to the national press, and then we've got an article that was put into City AM a couple of weeks ago in terms of what we're doing. What was really interesting is actually how engaged our public affairs team were in this, more so than I expected. And their view is that actually we want to take the position that because we're talking to government on a regular basis about riders and the gig economy generally, we actually want to take a stance and push the government towards how do we actually be able to release more of our levy. So 25% is fine, but actually what could we do with 50% if we could give that? Or is there a way that we can start to pool a levy pot as an industry for companies that aren't using it, so actually we can start to use this for a real kind of position of strength? So we're going to start to talk to government way more about that. We're working with HIT on actually how do we start to land some of these messages through them as well, so we can go through multiple channels. But it's a really interesting one that has had no kind of internal challenges at all, which has been really nice. And then the other part for me is when we kind of internally think about these projects and programs, it's about how many boxes kind of can we tick. So actually, how many different parts of the business can we align this to? So we obviously have this negative connotation externally around riders, and there is this kind of view that we don't treat riders properly. Again, don't buy into that, because the flexibility we offer is exactly what people want. But when we're thinking about these kind of programs, we've got this pool of 30,000 riders in the UK, and we have a bit of a duty of care to make sure that actually if you are a rider and you want to get a permanent role or look at a new career, we want to be able to support that. So we offer online courses through Open Classroom. So there's 700 online courses that any of our riders can take, as many as they want. So whether they're language skills, data science, coding, whatever it might be, they are free to be able to do that. We have a fine balance because we are obviously, these people are self-employed, so we can't treat them like employees, so we can't necessarily offer the same benefits and the same kind of support. So a lot of it is around how do we signpost opportunities to them. So actually, can we use this 30,000 strong population to engage with, to point them in the direction of HIT, who we can now say, essentially, if you want to become a chef or work in the hospitality industry, we've got this pot of money that you can utilize. Go and talk to HIT, they'll find you a role, and we can pay for your training as a result. So we're hoping that from a HIT perspective, they can start to see an influx of talent coming in through our rider population as well, which is quite an interesting way of thinking about it. So that's kind of the giveaway. We're still exploring it. We're going to see how that goes. The one extra thing on that is actually what we can start to do through conversations is identify parts of the country which we want to support. So if we think that there is a particular part of the country where we want to target, HIT are a national-based company with training centres all over the UK, and obviously Deliveroo operates across the whole of the UK. So we can start to turn on kind of micro targeting. And one of the examples is Islington, where we have our own kitchen site with a view of actually we need to work with local planning regulations on how we get all of that approved. So we need to go to those local schools and council and say, as a result of this, we can offer apprenticeship opportunities, we can start to give money back to the local restaurants, we can offer work experience and all of those kind of conversations. So it's given us way more freedom to be able to kind of focus on those kind of wider issues that we're going to face. But onto the makers, which we are the software engineers. This was the real challenge, where we get told on a regular basis that we don't have enough managers to support hiring junior people. The bar is really high, as we keep getting told, but actually we just need to kind of make some of this stuff happen, because every year we don't do it, we're losing another year. So we've run a pilot over the last 3 months, and we've essentially gone for 2 internal people who we're retraining. So one person was in our recruitment team and one person was in our customer services team. They have moved in to become engineers, and then we've had 2 people externally that we've hired through makers through their own talent pools. What was really interesting about makers is the average age of their talent pool is 29, and they are essentially people being retrained. And from our perspective, we are really pleased to say that 3 out of the 4 that we've hired are female, and 2 of them are returning mums who haven't been in work for the last 2 or 3 years, which is a real kind of testament to the program itself. 15 internal applications overall that we then had to whittle down to get to the 2 internal. And then we ended up having 6 internal interviews and 6 external ones. One of the really interesting takeaways for me was actually we had to change the recruitment process halfway through this. So while we were looking at the external talent pool, for those people who hadn't been in work for 2 or 3 years, it became really evident that we were so entrenched and so ingrained in the language we use as a business about being fast-paced and needing resilience, and all of those kind of things that actually some people might not have come across in the same way as a tech company, and being entrepreneurial and empowering people. Our questions kind of overwhelmed people that hadn't been in work for a couple of years. So we got through the initial interviews and realised that we couldn't really get a strong read because these people seemed really nervous, so we weren't sure what it was. So we ended up having to change tact and get them back in for informal conversations to see, get a bit more of a strong read on it. So that was a really interesting learning curve. Like I say, they're coming back into the business as of Monday, so these are people who have never done coding before, and it's going to be a real test for them to see how they kind of fit into the team, but also it'll be a really good sense for where we are as a business on how we can support these people. But it's a pretty exciting step forward, and I think the fact that 3 out of the 4 are female in particular is something that we're very much, like most people in this room, that are hiring for tech grads, women in engineering and tech in general is obviously a big area of interest. So then kind of key numbers from a delivery perspective. So our yearly levy, 356,000. That's obviously based on where we were last year, so that's kind of doubled, and the fact we haven't spent that money means that we've got a pot of double that just sitting there. At the moment, we're somewhere between £14,000 and £18,000 a month that we're just losing. So this is kind of why this is serious. We can sit and do nothing, but this money is going straight back to the government for them to do whatever they want with, whereas we can be using £14,000 to £18,000 every month once this program kicks off to train chefs, in theory, if we can get the government to move on the 25%, or not us, but as an industry, if we can move on the 25% giveaway. Our giveaway this year is £80,000, so we're going to commit to give that away, and that essentially means that we can train 16 chefs across the country. The view next year is likely to be 100,000, so the view is actually we'd like to be training at least 20 chefs across the industry every year, with a commitment that over 5 years that obviously becomes kind of 100 new chefs into the industry, which, you know, every little helps. We've only got 8 internal apprentices, but we're hoping to double that with the cohort they talked through, which will be really exciting to see. And actually, one of the real strengths that we see with apprentices is they just have this desire to learn stuff and to take things on. So we had one of the guys who's in our IT support team who essentially helped run a Black History Month event because he saw that we weren't doing anything in the office, and he just took that and ran with it because it was something that was passionate to him. And I'm sure throughout the day you've heard similar stories of how much of an influence and how much of an impact these kind of young people can have on the whole culture of businesses if you get it right. So that's really exciting. And essentially, with the levy giveaway, with makers, with the internal apprenticeships, we are still only going to spend 50% of our levy this year. So, you know, the government are going to end up with 150,000, 160,000 pounds to go and do whatever they want with as a result, which is a huge shame. And I'm sure it's probably something that everyone echoes in here that isn't spending their levy. The other thing that we are just working on with hopefully a view to create pipelines is, as I kind of touched on, is how do we start to do school engagement. So that's our office. It's what we call the Roo pitch. It's a five-a-side football pitch that you're not allowed to play five-a-side football on. You're only allowed to do yoga. But it is a great space where we can invite people in. So we will be hosting World of Work days for students and schools. We host graduate events. We do kind of meetups and tech events on there. And the thing that we're starting to talk to local schools that we want to engage with is how do we use the restaurants that we work with to actually kind of include them in that as well. So we've recently been speaking to a sushi restaurant, and they've agreed to come in and do sushi making classes as part of the curriculum for some of the schools that we're going to start to engage in as well, which is really cool. And again, I think it's a great example of if you can align your early careers program with essentially the core of what your business does and kind of create some synergy, it makes that offering so much stronger. So that's kind of the big plan for this year, is how do we engage. And that is essentially everything we're working on at the time, for the time being, but I'm sure there's going to be more that comes up, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions. And those are just our values that we talk a lot about.